Okay, great. Well, I see all the attendees to the webinar coming in here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Waples with NASSP, and thank you very much for joining the 2020 State of American Education virtual event hosted by the NASSP Policy and Advocacy Center. Every year at the annual National Principals Conference, the State of American Education session informs school leaders and conference attendees about what's happening in the current landscape of national education policy, what trends are emerging in states, and what changes schools may expect to see in the near future. Leading educators, school leaders, policymakers, and advocates offer diverse perspectives on what's needed to continue to improve schools and safeguard education for all students. Although NPC 2020 was canceled due to COVID-19, we're pleased to still present this year's State of American Education session with you all here today on Zoom. With schools facing so many challenges right now and state and federal legislators making so many consequential decisions about the future of K-12 education, this conversation is critical right now. So just a couple of quick housekeeping items as we're getting started with the webinar this afternoon. First of all, today's event is meant to be interactive. So if you have questions, we hope you will engage in the conversation by using the chat and Q&A features that you see pictured on screen here. If you have a question or comment at any point during the presentation, please type it in there. We'll keep an eye on questions throughout the presentation, and our moderators will take time at the end of the discussion to address them. We plan to collect the questions from the chat and Q&A that our panel doesn't get to today as well and follow up with you on those. We also encourage you to continue today's discussion on social media. We are using the hashtag #PrinciplesAdvocate on Twitter, and we are also simultaneously—
Wait, I gotta get out of this, hang on,
Sorry. And we are also simultaneously streaming this event on Facebook. So welcome to those of you who are watching us on Facebook Live as well. And also please feel free to use the comment section there to enter your questions. We'll be monitoring that as well. Now I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for today's discussion, who will introduce our panel. Christina Samuels is an associate editor with Education Week, where she focuses on covering educational equity, including policies or programs that promote or block students' opportunity to learn. She's been with EdWeek since 2004 and had previously reported for the Washington Post and Miami Herald. Christina, welcome, and thank you for moderating the discussion today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. This is a great panel and obviously an extraordinarily meaty set of subjects to talk about. Let me just briefly introduce everyone before we get started. We have State Representative Melissa Provenzano. She's a Democrat who represents Oklahoma's 79th District, and she was elected in 2019. Representative Provenzano is a former teacher and high school administrator. Catherine Procope, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. You're the head of school at Howard University's School of Mathematics and Science in Washington, D.C. Catherine has been recognized as a 2020 NASSP Digital Principal of the Year for exhibiting bold, creative leadership to harness the potential of new technologies to further learning goals. And school starts Monday. I'd like to also introduce Doug Williams. He's the superintendent of Sunnyvale Independent School District. It's in suburban Dallas, Texas. And Doug is also the president-elect of the Texas Association of School Administrators, and school also starts for you next week. Also joining us, but it'll be a little bit later, is Randy Weingarten. She's obviously the president of the American Federation of Teachers and has been in that role since 2008. The AFT represents, excuse me, 1.7 million teachers and other school staff around the country. And so I'm just going to start off with launch into some questions. I want to start with Catherine, but I wanted to ask this question of everybody. as we're reopening schools, I think that one thing that is uppermost in so many people's minds is equity. Equity is this huge conversation. We see equity, certainly specifically around the protests that we saw earlier this year, but also equity in seeing how schools responded to the pandemic and all the questions that that raised. I wonder if there is a theme or something that comes to mind for you in your own work when you think about equity. What does that mean for you? And Catherine, I'll just start with you.
Well, one of the good things about our school is Howard University Middle School was thinking about equity back in 2005 and trying to make sure that every student didn't experience what I want to call digital poverty. So we sent and have always sent devices home with students, provided access to Wi-Fi, but that makes our students ideal and different because that doesn't exist everywhere in urban settings. And we've seen this happen since COVID. We've had situations where, you know, parents have had to sell the device because they needed some food. And so when you're thinking about equity, and especially now when it's required that students have access to a device, that they have access to Wi-Fi, we have to look at how are we making sure that's happening everywhere. If it's difficult in an urban setting, I can't even imagine what it looks like in a rural setting. And so from a legislative standpoint, and I'm going to leave that to you, Melissa, too, is that how are we looking at broadband everywhere? Why can't that happen? If we've got broadband in a fast food restaurant, there's no reason why it can't be available in all the neighborhoods for everyone there. So digital poverty is what I try to call it, because that's what's actually happening, and we have to make sure we address it for every single student everywhere.
Sure. Well, that's a great transition, Melissa, to you and the work that you do and how you see equity in your own work.
Honestly, first, thank you to all the principals. I miss not being in a school, and this just makes me miss it even more. I'm a middle school principal at heart, but here in the state of Oklahoma, it's poverty and rural access. When we had the shift in March quickly, most of the kids across the state had a device, had Wi-Fi access, but for those kids, and it was a significant percentage of them, just did not have those devices. We loaned out as many as we could, but then we were relegated to worksheets. And so our school districts have been working all summer to rectify that problem, but it looks a lot of different ways. And it can look like, you know, spending our CARES Act funding to purchase devices and purchase hotspots for those kids. And in the urban areas, we've been successful, but in our rural areas, it looks a bit different. And if you layer on poverty on top of that, it's exacerbated. Because, you know, in our rural areas, we don't have the broadband access in our state yet. And we're working towards that, but we need it now. and I'm talking about, you know, these folks that may even have internet access at their home, but they have data packages. And if you watch one movie, that's your data for the month. And so those are the sorts of things that we're grappling with at this time. And as we reopen, we've made those investments, but then you start to deal with the parents with distance learning. If we're addressing equity, those parents that can't afford to stay home with their kids and they can't afford to leave their children at home alone for distance learning. And so there's this growing divide between the parents who can pay for childcare or pay for private schooling and then those who can't. And it's a challenge, right?
Sure. You know, before we move on, you know, I just thought, Melissa, could you describe where your district is? I just thought for people who maybe are not familiar with the state.
Sure. In Oklahoma, there are two major metropolitan areas, and I represent a portion of Tulsa, which is in the northeast corner of Oklahoma.
Sure, sure. And tell me a little bit about how you all are thinking about equity in your district.
Yeah, I think Melissa makes a great point. When we think about equity in the distance learning, the at-home learning environment, it really is. It has to go beyond just making sure that all of our students have devices and connectivity. It really, to me, the heart of the issue is how can we make sure that we are providing equitable services for kids who may not have parents there that can assist them in that work. I think schools are going to have to be very intentional in understanding the individual needs of their children, and how can we provide for those needs, just to make sure that that those kids that may be left by themselves because the parents do have to go back to work, have that instructional support that they're going to have. I so agree I so agree with what Catherine said, that it's incumbent on our lawmakers to make sure that we have resources there to be able to put devices in the kids' hands, and we can accomplish those things from a connectivity standpoint. But it also has to be about addressing individual students' needs. And principals, I will just tell you how valuable you are. There's no question the toughest job in a school district is the principal's position, but it's also so valued because you impact kids daily. And I appreciate that, but I just encourage you to encourage your teachers as this ramp up to school starts. They've got to develop relationships with kids. They need to understand what those needs are.
Sure. And I thought before I move on to my next question, this also might be useful for the audience to know where you all are in terms of how your schools are going to open this fall. Doug, do you mind sharing a little bit about what you're going to be doing? And then Melissa, you can talk a little bit about what your area districts are doing, and Catherine as well.
So we're a relatively small school district in Dallas County. We have 2,000 students. And so we have almost hand scheduled our 2,000 students. We sent out surveys to our parents about 3 weeks ago, and we've offered 3 learning modules. We have students that will be that will be at home, that will be full virtual. We have in-person all-day students, and then we also have students that are going to take advantage of what we call blended learning. And so they'll come in the morning or be home in the afternoon, and vice versa. So there'll be 3 different models that we have, with the thought that we want to try to provide as much in-person instruction as possible, but we want to keep class sizes small, and to be able to do that, to provide as much social distancing as we can. I know I was talking to our high school principal this morning, and the largest class that he's going to be looking at will be 16 students. And so we feel like that's really going to help in that distancing aspect. Right now, 1/3 of our students have opted to stay home and do full virtual, but the other 67% will be here in person in some capacity.
Okay. Melissa, what are you seeing in the districts that you represent? I don't know if there's multiple school districts.
There are actually. We have Tulsa Public Schools that has opted to go for the first 9 weeks distance learning. Then we have Union Public Schools that I represent a portion of, who will be meeting in person. And but there are virtual options for those parents who've chosen to do that. And those 2 butt right up next to each other within my district. But then we have private schools all across the urban area, and then we butt up to Jinx and Broken Arrow, and on the south side in Bixby, and so we're just kind of surrounded. So it's been fascinating because they all have different reopening plans, and
that's interesting.
The population, when they're not in school, cross-pollinates quite a bit.
Yeah. Catherine, what's happening in your school?
And we're following the district, and we're opening virtually. Doug said something really key about, we do have that same situation where, we're opening virtually, and we have parents who have to go to school, and there's children who are going to be home. And so one of the things that and all schools are making sure they do is having some contact point for that child, to make sure that somebody's checking in with them and making sure they're okay, and that they can get on, but it's going to be all virtual for us.
I'm working on a story. It'll be coming out in the next handful of days about the many different businesses, boys and girls clubs, YMCAs, churches, entrepreneurial folks who have come forward to provide care for parents who need to work, and while those kids are doing that full day, those full day remote lessons. But it's money. You know, not everybody has the opportunity to do that. And yeah, so it's definitely a challenge to be faced. You know, pivoting to politics, our favorite discussion, you know, I think that education, it's interesting. Obviously, you know, it's funny, as an education reporter, I often, you know, I think, of course, this is the most important thing in the world. And I wonder sometimes, in previous years, I have wondered, you know, why don't politicians see this as the, you know, essential lifeblood of the community like I do? Well, now we do, but now we're in a, you know, where it becomes almost kind of a toxic politicization of around what's going on. How did we get here, Melissa? How can we get out of it? Can we get out of this?
You bet we can. You bet we can. Honestly, I'll just be very frank, the lack of real decisive leadership amongst the different levels of government has been a major concern, you know, with the inconsistent messaging on what staying safe looks like, to mask or not to mask, how the virus spreads. And to be fair, this is a novel virus, so we're all sort of, you know, flying a plane and attaching the wings and hoping for the best. So there's some grace there. But again, you know, it's the absence of a clear and concise message from federal to state to local school district has been a struggle, at least here in Oklahoma. And, you know, something as simple here in Oklahoma as to whether to put a mask on or not put a mask on is dividing the population. And it's so silly because we have children whose parents are registered Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and libertarians, you name it, and it just can't matter. Science doesn't care what political party you are, you know, and that's kind of where we have to start moving forward. The state school board in Oklahoma recently took a vote on the adoption of a color coding model that would guide schools about whether your county is, you know, red, yellow, green, orange, safe to be having school in person. And their proposal was a mandate. Let's do this. And if this is where you are, this is the recommended thing you do. But the board voted it down and moved to just make a recommendation. And as a result, we have schools across the state doing school much differently. And being an advocate for local control is one thing, but we also need clear and concise messaging. And now we have schools that have been open a week. And gosh, I think at last count, we had up to 20 different school districts who have people coming out with diagnosed cases, and how they're handling it is different across the board. So I think, you know, it's time. The first thing we need to do is put, you know, just like principals do, is it good for the student? And we need to start deciding, you know, put the student at the center of the decision making. And then I think that the right answers will start to tease out for us.
You know, Doug and Catherine, I don't want to put you on the spot about the politics of it, but I will say that, I mean, obviously this is something that you have to navigate. You have to navigate this in your communities because you may have different parents, teachers feeling different ways about this. Doug, I'm wondering how you have worked through perhaps the many different views that might be in your community about how to handle school reopening.
Well, yeah, Christina, definitely politics is entering into this equation, and it's a shame that our kids are being used as political pawns. Just to be incredibly frank about it, we're a fairly conservative community. Would be, you know, traditional Republican community. As a suburb, our county as a whole is fairly Democrat control, but you know the state of Texas is a red state, and so we are being pulled between state and local and getting really direction from both. I do advocate for local control. We need input from our local health officials. We need input from our education agency, but we have looked at data about the number of cases in Sunnyvale, and it's about half of what we were experiencing as in the county as a whole. And also, given our plan, we felt comfortable in bringing our kids back in person this coming Tuesday, the 25th. We also have some clear protocols in place as we look at the different numbers, and do we have lab confirmed cases, and how will we handle that? One question that I saw come up on the screen is masking policy. We are going to be strictly enforcing masking policy. That's something that we believe will help mitigate the spread more than anything else, and so we will be doing that. Now, the elementary principals that are listening, I guess this is secondary school principals, so we may not have elementary principals on this call. That may be TEPSA, but we are looking at maybe some exceptions for our elementary, for our young kids. We've got plexiglass coming, and we have shields, so that if they're involved in reading groups and things like that, they wouldn't be masked, but they would be behind the protection of that plexi.
You know, Catherine, I wonder, is it easier, air quotes, when you have the mayor, for example, the mayor of DC saying, you know, this is where you are. So in a way, you don't have to get perhaps into arguments or back and forth with the community, because you can say, here's what we all are doing. Or does that present its own set of challenges?
Well, one of the things, because we're a charter school, the mayor does make those decisions. However, we do have some autonomy as well. And from a decision making, for us, it was really totally what's going to be the safest solution for the teachers and the students. And we have done similar things to what Doug described. We've got shields, we've got plexiglass, we have some NASA level disinfecting going on in the building. I mean, you name it, and we did it, and trying to think about, okay, what would it look like to bring a student in? What would it look like for a teacher to have to wear a mask and a shield for an hour, 2 hours, and try and teach a class? We thought really long and hard about that, and really it's totally about what's going to keep the children safe. And then also thinking about the parents too, because here we are going virtual, and our children are, you know, of a digital age and they're ready, but some of our parents are not. And so thinking, how can we provide supports to everyone in our community? And you're right, the mayor was totally about what's going to keep folks safe, and I applaud her for that. And that's exactly what we've been looking at here as well.
Mm-hmm. You know, Melissa, I wonder, there's been some really interesting surveys that have come out that have asked parents what their comfort level in returning to school. You often see that parents of color have many more misgivings about returning to in-person classes. And, you know, as we know, sadly, families of color have often been sort of impacted most heavily by coronavirus. I wonder if that's something that you're seeing at all. I don't know about the, you know, the level of diversity, or whether there's been those similar surveys or conversations in your community about some groups that feel comfortable, some groups that don't. You know, how do you handle
that? I think so. I guess I would classify it, let me think carefully here, but I think for me, it sort of centers on poverty and the risk that parents have to mitigate. You know, I've got to go to work, but I don't feel comfortable sending my child to a sit-in day. What do? I'm in a tight spot. I can't care. And so you're sort of in a rock and a hard place, and you're the one that's forced to make the decision. In Tulsa Public, and they did do a survey of parents, and it was, oh gosh, I don't believe they surveyed the demographics, to be quite frank, but it was, you know, a lot of worry, but a lot of need to have kids back. And it raises that question of, you know, I think public schooling is going to look different forever once we're done, because, gosh, it's been a nice place for parents. They can plan around their children's school day, be home when they get home, or arrange for childcare after. And right now, parents are the ones sort of scrambling. And I guess from that perspective, you know, I hope that answers your question.
Sure. No, I mean, it's interesting when I'm doing these stories as a reporter, and I'm talking with parents and talking with schools, and just realizing how like incredibly challenging these decisions are, because they're being made in an absence of knowledge, and through nobody's fault. You know, people just don't know a lot.
And I have a fellow representative who's been researching the effect on our Black students and our Black families, and she's COVID actually is more harshly here in the state of Oklahoma impacting them, but they still, you know, have to make the decision on whether or not to send their child to school or not, depending on their situation, their home life, who they have living in the home, the level of risk is different from family to family. Perhaps, you know, you have a immunocompromised person or a person that's older living in your home, and when you send your child to school every day, putting that parent, that grandparent at risk. And so you just like, what a heavy decision for teachers and principals and administrators and superintendents, but what a heavy decision for parents. There's just no easy answer.
Right. Right.
We've actually, Christina, so the registration form that we sent out, the deadline for declaring which learning model your students would be in, where it was at lunch today. We have had parents that have changed their mind and have selected at one point all 3 learning models. They really just are struggling with this.
Mm-hmm.
And I can completely understand that. One of the things that we've worked really hard on are those protocols. I saw a comment pop up about contact tracing. I've got a technology whiz that's our director, and he's actually designed an app that we used in some of our summer conditioning programs in athletics, in band, this summer, and we test piloted that, where the kids are doing they're doing a daily self-report, and we will know. They'll just answer some questions, but then it will also provide that if we do have a positive come up, then we'll know which of the students were around each other, and I think that's going to be able to help in some of our decision making going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting how well in some ways the students have adjusted to this. I have a second grader, and he's in a day camp program. When he first started wearing masks, I was really worried. Oh my gosh, he'll be so upset. They're hot. He doesn't like them because they're hot, but he doesn't mind them because they frighten him or he's worried or anything like that. He just finds them uncomfortable. But yeah, I think kids will follow our lead if we give them a lead to follow, which is the challenging.
Right.
And if we act freaked out, they'll be freaked out.
Absolutely.
You know, we have some students who are struggling because 96% of our students and our families are African American. And we've had a lot of students lose grandparents, aunts, uncles. And so this is like really real and personal for them. And I had a family just flat out tell me, you know, I'm older and my son has 2 grandparents and I want to make sure that they stay well. And so we're staying home. And so I think one of the things we have to remember is, you're right, they are resilient, but this is affecting them too. Like they want adults fix this, and we can't. And so, you know, they may, and that's where, you know, our social emotional learning and those support people in the schools are going to come in very, very key, because our children are going to need those supports.
Yeah, that's a great point, Catherine. That's a great point.
Yeah, you know, you bring up a great transition to this next question that I have, which is obviously this larger conversation, or an additional conversation we're having on top of coronavirus and everything that has wrought. Obviously, this summer has been a really, painful, in some cases necessary, reckoning in many communities about issues about racial justice and how that plays out in the schools. It's interesting because even though schools were not in session, there was just sort of an immediate, I think, knowledge among educators that, you know, here we are at a moment where we really need to step up here. And, you know, Doug, I wonder how this conversation is playing out in your district. On top of everything else that you have to do.
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing else going on. So we did what any good school administrators do. We reached out to our community and we formed a team. And so we have a diversity and inclusion team that's been meeting. The first thing that we did was we wanted to really identify what the needs of our community was. And that discussion really led to a formation of 3 subcommittees that are now doing some work. here's where we are. Here's at the heart of it, Christina. In relation to this, I think that you have to really peel it back and know this. Schools are about teaching kids. And I think that we have a responsibility to teach kids and to really work with kids on inclusivity is one of the words that we are spending a lot of time talking about, on awareness. I think that is so important as we continue to work through this. And then really, what are we teaching kids is vital as well, from the standpoint that our curriculum is regulated by a state board of education. And we must have some frank conversation about what's actually being taught in our social studies classes. We shared when the panel got together a week ago, and this really kind of hits pretty close home to Melissa because of the area that she serves. But I was a social studies major, and I did not know about the Tulsa Massacre until a couple months ago. And that's a shame, because that was not taught in classes, and it needs to be. That really, that fact hammered home to me that we need to do some analysis about what's being taught. And I don't think school leaders can hide behind well, we can't have those conversations. We have got to have those conversations in our school district. And honestly, we've got to have those conversations across the state as well. My capacity in TASA, I spent 2 years as the legislative chair and made some relationships with key legislators, and then also with members of our State Board of Education. We've had some conversations about how the state board needs to address curriculum issues.
Catherine, how about yourself? This has been a big discussion in DC, of course.
You know, it's funny, as Doug said, I don't know if we were in school around the same time, but the Tulsa Massacre wasn't taught in my school either. However, my parents taught us. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that Black people have been killed by police for years and years and years. And it only became an issue when it became very, very public. And when we talk about it, we do have to, as educators, teach it in the school, but it's not going to stop there. Because I can teach a child something in a classroom, but if they go home and they're hearing something else, what I'm teaching goes right out the window. And so that whole conversation about anti-racism cannot just be inside the school. It has to be throughout the community. We have to involve the families. We have to really drive down to make sure that the conversations are broad enough that changes really are happening. It's really easy to change a curriculum. We just add a few things and move some stuff aside and put in the things that need to be there. But are we really affecting the change that needs to happen in the community? Probably not, until we have those honest conversations that Doug described, and they're honest and they're brutal, and we start looking at ourselves and the things that we're thinking about, the things that we're telling our children, and we talk to their families about the things that they're telling their children, and that's how we're going to make the change.
I think I just heard a mic drop.
Absolutely. But Melissa, I wonder, is this something as a legislator I wonder how you were seeing this, because you were saying your heart is still in schools. I mean, I can imagine when you see all these, you just want to sort of start teaching. I mean, this is just such a moment.
Yeah, you just kind of want to go, here, I got you.
Mm-hmm.
Here in Tulsa, it's sort of laid bare right now, the conversation, because of, the absence of the lack of teaching about the Tulsa Race Massacre. Calling it the Tulsa Race Massacre, as we kind of talked about, just only changed 2 years ago. Before then, it was called a riot. And I didn't learn about it in school, but learning about it in school is the most powerful first step. But like Catherine said, you cannot stop there. And, we had a Black Lives Matter mural painted in Tulsa on Greenwood. And it has been, after the protests, and it has been so, it's been a very raw and open conversation, and you're really kind of laying bare the needs that we have in our community, that start educating about the subject and looking and going, okay, there's some emotion here and we've got to step in and do something community-wide.
You know, I saw a comment scrolled by on the chat that I don't want to let go, because this is an important point as well, is that, you know, one of the things that we're talking about in terms of racial equity, you cannot look at sometimes like the academic performance or the, you know, low literacy rates and stuff like that. I feel like that is as much a part of this conversation of how are we educating our children in the building blocks of what they need to succeed in life. And there's been these, you know, gaps or opportunity gaps, achievement gaps that we talk about for so long. And I'm sure that this is at the top of your minds as well. You know, how do we address that and also create a school where people feel comfortable and loved and wanted, cherished, and can bring their entire culture into this school, but also are learning to read and math and graduate on time and all of these other things. Schools do a lot. It's a lot of stuff. I am going to change quickly to money. Money is a huge issue. Melissa, I'd love to just start with you, obviously, because in a lawmaker's capacity, I think that a lot of people are looking at what may be happening with school district budgets as we get, as we see the effects of coronavirus play out. Well, how are things looking in Oklahoma? Are you seeing like a tidal wave coming and you're like, or
right.
Yeah.
So we did get quite a bit of CARES funding, and the largest percentage of it ran through the title formula and filtered out to the schools based on need. Our governor also got about $40 million in gear funds, which he has used to do some good. Some he's funneled into private voucher-driven schools. And we can debate all day and into the night about that, but they've used it to purchase PPE, sanitizing, shields, those sorts of things. But, you know, that is in short supply. And before he did that, that was just last week. Before he did that, you know, we've had this money for a minute. Schools were competing with one another budget-wise and bidding competitively against one another for masks and for Clorox wipes. And, you know, most every teacher that I know has, you know, always had on like their supply list, you know, for parents who can send a thing of Clorox wipes will have it. Any of us been able to buy those recently? It's a struggle. And like the day it comes in is the day it ships out and into somebody's house. And so access to safe equipment has been a hot topic. So I think we're moving in the right direction. The filtration piece in districts has been a hot topic. You know, that's kind of, we released a, you know, only when it's safe, 7 steps to returning, you know, and PPE, adequate PPE was one, but then adequate filtration. You have some buildings that have multiple floors, and one of the recommendations is open a window. Some windows don't open. Yeah, and, you know, you have old buildings with really old HVAC systems that just need to be replaced. But in a newer building, it might be as simple as removing a filter or leaving your door open. And so it has to look different from district to district. And I bless the superintendent at this level because, you know, if you're in a large district, it looks different from building to building to building. And so using those funds in the most efficient way, you know, this would be the argument for local control because the superintendents know what their buildings need.
Right.
Yeah.
Doug, yeah, please. I was about to ask you how the funding piece is playing out for you.
Well, I think one of the things that we're going to have to keep in mind is we may not see the true impact of what COVID-19 has done to the economy and to budgets maybe until 21-22 school year. You know, 2021, our budget is almost done, and we have we are going to receive state support, but yet there's going to be an impact, and I think that we're going to see a dramatic cut in funding from the state. One of the things that the state of Texas did, and the state of Texas received $1.2 billion in CARES Act or in ESSERS funds from the federal government. And they sent that out to the school districts. However, they cut the school district's foundation money that they were to receive. And so I guess the best example I could give you is if your employer knew that you got the $1,200 from as a part of the stimulus or the CARES money from as an individual, your employer wouldn't say, well, we know you got $1,200 from the feds, so we're going to cut $1,200 from your salary. And that's what the state of Texas did. It was a cost-saving mechanism. It saved them $1.2 billion because the Texas economy is incredibly driven by oil and gas revenue. And so the funding that goes to schools when oil and gas goes down, and everybody is really happy because you're paying $1.50 for fuel, that means that we're going to have a financial crunch. And so we're going to see that. What we have to do is we have to advocate. Again, we have to go back to the Capitol. We've got to talk about the impact it's going to have on kids and on education. And we can't talk about, our budgets. We can't talk about anything other than that. And I will tell, the one conversation that my principals and I, that conflict is when I tell them, hey, we're going to have to cut, teaching units and class sizes increase and all of that. Catherine would get mad at me. I'm a little scared of her to begin with. So he would absolutely tell me that's not going to happen, Mr. Williams. But really, it's tough conversations we have that we should not have to have. The emphasis has got to go back to making sure that we're adequately funded so that my principals can have the teachers they need and the teachers can teach the kids.
Yeah, here in Oklahoma, the other piece is that mid-year adjustment that's coming. Because right now, since June, July, our virtual school provider is now the largest provider in the state. And so, and school districts, brick and mortar school districts are kind of like, come back to us. We have distance learning. Before you leave, check us out. But there's the disconnect between what shutting down in March looked like, which was crisis teaching on the fly, and like, let's just do the best we can. Our teachers and our principals have been planning all summer. So distance learning is going to look much different this fall. But communicating that out to a broad audience is difficult. But if they don't get it done, then our school districts across the state are going to see giant budget cuts in mid-year. It's going to be tough.
And so in the District of Columbia, of course, we're not looked at as a state for reasons unknown, no representation. And so when the CARES funding came, it didn't come equally. And that was one issue. And then as we are getting, per pupil funding as students are registering because schools are closed, that whole registration piece for parents has been really challenging. Doug is 100% right. This is about the children. And so funding is not, it shouldn't be political. And so we really need to take it to the hill, no offense, Melissa, and make sure that they understand that funding for students, we can't even question it. We have to make sure it happens.
Randy, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so glad that you were able to, and this is perfect timing because one of the questions that I was just about to ask was about concerns about, we just finished talking about funding, and one of the concerns is about teacher and principal attrition. This has been, a perennial issue, and I've only got to think that coronavirus and the concerns are at least making some teachers, perhaps many, and principals say, maybe retirement doesn't look so bad now. Is there anything that we can be doing or that we should be doing to work to retain teachers and principals, especially when we need so many good folks to stay in the profession?
So, so first, my apologies for being delayed. I don't know what is going on today, but today has become the explosion of school reopening issues
Really?
all across the country. I know it is crunch time, but today in particular has been lots of local issues and state issues, and my apologies, but as you can imagine, I'm trying to deal with, if there's a state issue and a crisis, I'm trying to deal with it. So right now, so this is what I think you're going to see. Someone today who was a teacher testifying in the hearing, trying to block the Florida order that basically said there has to be a brick and mortar option 5 days a week everywhere, regardless of community spread. So we're in court right now in Florida. One of the witnesses started crying and said, well, I'm resigning tomorrow because I'm not going to I take care of my mother, and I'm not going to put her in a situation where I may be bringing COVID home and killing her. And that's the kind of anguish that I'm hearing all that, it's not every single person, but that is the kind of anguish. There's because it's been so mishandled, and I don't want to get into the politics, I know, but because it's been so mishandled at the federal level in the United States, you have no good solutions anywhere. And so I think what you're going to see is, we're already seeing it, but we'll know more in September and October. Far more people retiring, resigning, taking leaves at the very same time as kids actually need more experienced people who really understand how to deal with a stressful situation. And it's not as if we're going to be able to get substitutes now. And it's not as if new teachers are thrust into this situation. I have a friend who's becoming a new teacher, thrust into the situation where they're dealing with 3 crises at the same time: economic recession, a pandemic, and a long needed reckoning with racism. And so our kids are walking into schools or into Skype or into Zoom, all of that on their shoulders. So yes, anecdotally, we're seeing more and more. I would not have been adverse to us, given the knowledge of that the disease affects someone who is my age or older. I'm 62. I would not have been adverse to us being able to negotiate, retirement incentives. That was one of the ideas from one of the conservative groups, but nobody did it. So now you have a situation where you really have Hobson's choices all over the place. And I think that you're going to see a lot of experienced people do it. The surveys we have is in Florida, 39% of those who are eligible to retire want to, and in Michigan, 32% want to. But those are, just survey documents that we've taken.
Sure.
The state of Oklahoma, we have, just was in the paper last weekend, 17% of the entire population of teachers is eligible to retire. And added to that, we had the teacher walkout in 2018, and we got, teachers a raise, and so many teachers decided to stay on board for 3 more years because your teacher retirement's based off your highest 3 years, and we're kind of there. And so it's just a perfect storm of, we love you, please don't leave us. And, our average years of stay for a teacher is now right at 2.5 years. And is that what's best for kids? And so we've got to, administrators have to be the guides on the side and say, teachers, what is it that you need? Let me get that for you.
It goes back to what we talked about just a few minutes ago, and that's advocacy. And that's continuing to advocate for education, advocate for kids in classrooms, and what's best for kids in classrooms, quality teachers in the front of that class. My concern is what this is going to look like if we don't address it, and soon. Again, the state of Texas, we did score some victories in last session, and we saw some across the board raises for teachers that was well needed. But if we're not very, very active coming out, then we're going to lose the ground that we had. And we've got to keep teachers in the profession. Not only that, but we've got to continue to recruit the best and brightest to go into the profession. And that's a concern I have.
You know, as we have about 10 minutes left and I want to save a little time for questions, you see my eyes kind of going back and forth between the chat and the Q&A. There's one small question that came up, Doug. Somebody wanted to know the demographics of your district, the racial breakdown of your district.
We're a relatively diverse district. We're about 55% white, about 30% Asian American, 10% African American, and 10% Hispanic. And so just a diverse school district. Now, we are not, we have a small population of economically disadvantaged students, so around 12%.
I think that there was someone who was asking, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that I'm getting the correct question. These are some real kind of interesting nitty gritty logistical questions about like professional development and training of teachers. You know, I know that this is a large subject and probably we won't be able to do it justice in this amount of time, but I'm wondering if there's some resources, just broadly speaking, Doug and Catherine, that you all are using to, you know, provide professional development to your teachers in terms of distance, helping them with distance learning.
Yeah, I'm going to yield to Catherine because I know she's done some great things with PD, especially virtually. So
it's so funny that we forget that nobody was trained for this. And so, you know, what I will do is some things that I will drop in the chat. We're using Summit Learning as our learning management system. And one of the things that they did was provide a field guide, which was really nice, and it can be used for anything. And it was just things to tell teachers how to actually teach when they're at home and when they're virtual. And so what we're doing here as well during this week is actually practicing. And one of the things, somebody asked, what could parents do? And we've had lots of conversations with our parents, and they asked us the same question, and we asked them for grace. Because as we are going forward, we're going to make mistakes, and we need them to help us. And that was how we need grace. But I'll drop some of those links in the chat of some of the things that we're using. And again, as teachers, administrators, Doug said this too, that we can't clap and applaud enough every principal who's going through this, because this is nothing that we were ever trained for, ever planned for. And for teachers who are staying in the profession, stay, you guys, because the children need you.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
absolutely.
You know, Randy, I wanted to ask you too, and this is such a big question, but I think to myself, who would have thought in March, you know, that we would be here? What do you see education, where are we going? I mean, is it just, do you have the idea of how this may, you know, ultimately play out? There just feels like there's so many changes happening in so many different ways.
Well, look, I don't have a magic wand. And part of our problem is that we have a lot of people who are in power right now that have magical thinking as opposed to really focused on the science. But let me say, I'm actually, and this may sound really counterintuitive, I'm actually very hopeful, if for the following reasons. I think that America has finally seen, I think a couple of things happened. In March, I think, you know, we have not had a significant health pandemic in, you know, since in some ways tuberculosis and polio. And just like the generation of millennials and don't really understand what, you know, a country that is at war in terms of World War II, just like they've been amazing about the protests in terms of Floyd and saw a tipping point. I think this became a tipping point for younger people now to say, wait a second, this ain't the country that I actually want to be, I mean, I want to be a part of this country, but not in this way. That something is really wrong. And I think that there's a level of activism and kind of disgust with not handling it in a way that creates and makes human beings and their life more important than the ongoing obeisance to Wall Street. And I hear, people, like, you could see from even the Paul Peterson poll today that said 81% of Americans believe that health and safety is more important than anything you do for the economy. It's not that people don't want economic growth, but that is really important in terms of basic humanity. It kind of goes with grace, but basic humanity. And I think that if we, I would actually say that I think that DeVos and Trump, they don't really have another strategy but chaos and destabilizing. And again, I don't mean this politically, just look at their strategies. But I think that if we can, either through remote education or hopefully have some cohesiveness in the reopening, that not a lot of people get sick, that we can actually, if people get sick, we shut down, we go to remote, but there's a sense that we're all in it together. What it then shows, just like March, is that number one, public education is really important. Building community is really, really important. And people, when it's time to go back safely, I think there will be a huge influx in terms of the public schools, because people see remote doesn't work. Number two, I think that there's a lot of appetite for honoring science and the study of science. And just like in some ways during JFK and the fight to race to the moon, I think we're going to start seeing a lot of that work and project-based learning, there being a real appetite to that. And number three, and somebody just said this, people see that Maslow beats Bloom every day. And there is a real appetite to meet people where they are, meet our students where they are, meet our teachers where they are, try to create a way to de-stress, to actually be in it together, to deal with social emotional learning. I've heard more people talk about how we need community schools and wraparound services.
Yes.
So it's a very long-winded way for me to say, I am seeing a sense that we need to build community, start with the well-being of children, and that if we can, and using public education as foundational, and if we could actually make those three concepts consistent throughout the country, then we will actually start meeting the instructional as well as the social, emotional, and economic needs of children, instead of having these constant fights about how you do this. That's my
Don't you see the opportunity that we have? Parents who've heard, oh, public schools this, public schools that, they get the value of teachers right at this moment. And I can guarantee you that. They know exactly what their kids are getting and what they aren't. And so I think we have to seize on that and reshape the vision of public schools right now. And we have the opportunity to do it, because public schools do rock star things every single day, but they go largely overshadowed.
Yeah. I was just going to echo that. To me, we have got to change the narrative of what public schools are all about, and we've got to tell the great stories that are going on. Why aren't young people entering education? They don't want to enter what's being perceived as a failed system. Public education is not failing whatsoever, and we have to be champions in telling that story over and over again about the great things that are going on. And then, I'm a recruiter. If I see one of our kids coming back and I ask them what they're majoring in, if they don't have an answer, I tell them they need to be educators. Without question, we've got to promote what our system and our profession. There's no question about that.
Sure. Catherine, do you have a few
I
last
think
words to
one
say?
of it's always nice when you, I don't know if it's you're getting older. I don't know, Randy, I'm 66, so I don't know what that feels like. But we have, when your students come back and they're teachers, and that means that we are doing something really good. And you all said something really key. Parents have always known how good we are and all the things that we do. They may not say it because they've got things that they're doing as well. But I think this situation has really shown a bright light on the role that public education plays in the community. We are not just providing academics, we're providing food, we're providing shelter, we're providing social emotional help, we're the counselors, we're sometimes the uncles and aunts and whatever else, we're providing clothes, we're doing all of those things. It's a one-stop shop. And when it closed, the community suffered. So people are going to see and have seen now how good this is and how important education is, but specifically public education. And that light is going to continue to shine bright on all the amazing administrators and teachers who continue to work for our children.
Sure. I love leaving it on this note. Thank you all so much for joining us. And there was a really lively chat that I saw where people were talking to one another and answering each other's questions, which is wonderful. NASSP, thank you so much for inviting me to moderate this panel. And good luck to everyone. Good luck to all of us, teachers, parents, administrators. This is going to be a very interesting school year.
Have a great school year, folks.
Thank you, everybody.
And thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.